Hi, everyone. This is Pam Torrey from Engage, and you're listening to the Engaged podcast. Think about the whirlwind that is peak season for a home replacement remodeling company. Leads are flying in, reps sprinting from appointment to appointment, and managers juggling schedules, financing, and installs. When the dust finally settles, how do you capture what really worked, what fell flat, and most importantly, what your salespeople would change to make next year even better? To help us dig into that conversation, I am thrilled to welcome TJ Parsons of Hoty Training and Consulting. TJ started as a record setting rep, grew into a company wide trainer, and even built a brand new product division that booked over $600,000 in sales in just 2 weeks. Today, he lives the motto, teaching ordinary people how to do extraordinary things by coaching organizations across the country. TJ, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So we've had you on a webinar before, but I don't think we've ever had you on our podcast. And there are probably a lot of people here who either are unfamiliar with you or unfamiliar with Hoty Training and Consulting. So can you introduce yourself to our audience? Like, how did you get into this business? And then eventually, what led you to the Hoty organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started in the industry in 2011 at 21 years old as a sales rep for a top window and bath remodeling company in Columbus, Ohio. And over the years, I kind of grew into many different responsibilities, but found the most fulfillment through training and developing of salespeople. And I'm really proud to have played a role in helping that company grow from 17 million per year when I started to 40 million per year when I left that organization. And due to the success and the experience I had there, I was recruited by a national roofing company to help them build a retail solar division, where I essentially built a company within a company with less than 100 leads. And we generated about 1.2 million in net approved sales, which was pretty impressive. But, my relationship with Tony Hoty and Phil Wiley is what brought me to Tony Hoty Training and Consulting. I have great respect for both men, and Phil is like a brother to me. So the opportunity to work with him every day was something that I really couldn't pass up. And so now I work with Phil, helping companies all over the country by developing selling systems and improving performance, by training and mentoring sales managers and sales reps. And I also serve as the general manager for Window and Bath Expo, which is Tony's remodeling company in Cleveland. So there's really no better feeling than helping someone reach their full potential. And that's what I get to do every day.
I always forget that there's so much Tony Hoty presence in Cleveland. I went to college there. My mom lives there.
Oh,
So I'm
nice.
like, I'm there all the time. And I'm always like, oh yeah, that's why their events are often in Cleveland. That's why they're there.
Yes.
Uh, so we are, capping off busy season for much of the country, specifically for like all of our remodelers who are in the, Pacific Northwest, Upper Midwest, Northeast. Like they're heading into frosty season. We're going to hit a point where you're not going to want to be installing roofs in Wisconsin. Nobody wants to be doing that in January. But we're coming out of this busy season, this time when everybody is just running around. They're crazy. They've got more leads than they can handle. They're trying to get jobs installed before the weather shifts. So when you walk into a company right after all of that, right after a busy season, when people, might be a little bit burnt out, when they're trying to just assess what happened, what's the first indicator that tells you whether leadership is actually listening to their team members or they're just moving on to whatever's next?
It's a really great question. And I really think the first indicator is it always starts with, does that management team know their numbers?
Mm,
Because everything starts with analytics, everything starts with data. And to really know where you want to go, you have to know where you've been.
mhm,
So the key is they have to know their numbers forward and backward. And what I've seen is that management teams that really struggle are the ones that react the most to surface level information.
mhm,
So, for example, they see lower sales volume and they automatically assumes that means the sales team isn't doing their job. But if you actually look at the data, you see that leads were down by 25%, but close rates were up by 5%.
mhm.
So, in that scenario, the sales team had really done a phenomenal job, but, we had a weakness somewhere else in the organization. So you have to be intimately familiar with your data because that's really the only truth in the business. I think it all starts there.
Mhm. Yeah, it's so true, especially with what's going on in the industry right now, with the cost of leads going up, with challenges of trying to get people's attention. I mean, a lot of tried and true marketing practices aren't working. A lot of tried and true sales practices aren't working. Like if you don't know where you're starting from, if you don't know those numbers, you can't listen to your team because you don't understand what you're hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like a football team, right? If you don't
Mhm.
know, well, how many yards did we pass for and how many yards did we run for? I don't know. I just know that we had 200 yards total. It's like, well, that's not really going to help very much, is it?
Yeah, I know. So you and I have both worked with a lot of sales folks. You've been a salesperson. I have as well. I started my career doing that. And I think a nice way to say it is that sales reps can be passionate, especially when we consider the kind of like disc profiles that end up in sales often. These are people who tend to be very direct. They can often be very blunt and they can be, pretty forceful in their opinions because they care a lot and because, their income is often tied directly to their performance. So, how do you recommend that leaders sift through the many opinions that their sales reps might be offering to find those specific insights that might move the needle, that might actually impact change?
That's another great question. And I think you'll oftentimes find that salespeople are also sometimes the hardest people to get feedback from when things are
Mhm.
going poorly. And I think that starts almost with ego, which you
Mhm.
have to have a little bit of ego in this business to be
Yeah.
successful in
Yeah,
sales.
you
Is
can't do this
confidence.
job without it.
Yeah, yeah, and but because of that, a lot of people that have that character trait, they don't really want to take a lot of accountability, and a lot of the times it really can be a you can't see the forest through the trees type
Mhm.
situation. So when it comes to collecting feedback from the sales department, you really do have to proceed with caution. And the sales reps, are the only people in the whole organization that are actually in their customers' homes every single day, that are the ones, doing the job, trying to convert these leads into sales. And so no one is going to have any more real actionable feedback than those people would. However, as you mentioned, salespeople are passionate. They get animated. They like to exaggerate. I've seen it a couple hundred times. But when you meet with your team for a weekly sales meeting and you ask for feedback, and one or two of the reps goes on a long rant about lead quality, talking about, oh, there's too many no shows or there's too many one parties. But when you check the data, there might be only 3 for the entire company for the whole month, but all 3 happen to go to that one person, right?
Mhm.
So they are reacting loudly and in front of other people, and it might seem like a bigger issue, but the data again tells the truth. So while their feedback is essential, you do have to scrutinize it as well and really be on the lookout for bias.
Mhm.
But of course, you want to look for that consistent feedback from each team member, right? If your entire sales team is giving you the same consistent feedback, you're much more likely to get true data.
So on the topic of feedback, what feedback methods have you seen be successful with sales organizations? I've heard managers talk about surveys they do, some of them do ride-alongs, some of them do more roundtable type settings, or they do those conversations in their weekly meetings. Like what works and why?
It's a layered question, but I think the process, it really all starts with data and trends. Again, that's the
Mhm.
starting point, is just what does the data show? Is there a certain product that the team is underperforming on, or maybe a lead source that they're struggling with? So I want to know that information first and foremost. But the second is I want to start just by listening to the team. And again, I want to look for consistent feedback, similar experiences from person to person, so that we're not getting bias from one or two individual people. But I really think the biggest key, the most important thing, is doing ride-alongs, and whether that's doing them in person, the
Mhm.
traditional way, or using tools like Zero. There's
Mhm.
no better data than live data from the field, and I think that's always going to give you the most honest interpretation of what's going on, is if you actually see it and hear it for yourself.
Mhm. So you mentioned Zero, which they're one of our partners. We have an integration with them. We talk all the time about the importance of those analytics from the in-home appointment. We talk all the time about data. You've mentioned like you got to know your numbers,
Mhm.
but there is also in sales that soft feedback. The things about sentiment, the things about body language that you really can't get from numbers. Like you can't tell from the disposition of the call in the CRM how the homeowner was physically reacting to what happened during that sales appointment. So How do you suggest that leaders balance that type of anecdotal feedback from a sales rep or maybe even from a homeowner with that hard data that exists in the CRM, in your in-home sales analytics tools from things like Engage, Zero, maybe even your in-home sales software, financing information? Like how would I as a leader come in and like figure out how to balance that?
Yeah, I really think, the smartest leaders don't see those two different data sets as competing. They see them
Mhm,
as complementary. They're two parts to the same whole, right?
mhm,
And hard numbers from the CRM or Engage or Zero tell us what happened, but the feedback from the field tell us why it happened.
mhm,
And if you lean too heavily on one, you really miss the full picture. So a balanced leader is going to treat their gut as the hypothesis and then the data as the proof for that information or the correction. But
mhm,
I've seen teams really kill a campaign way too early because one rep said, "Oh, that this promo didn't land or this situation didn't work out. It's not as good as you think it is, right?"
mhm,
But when you pull the data and look at the numbers, the truth was that the reps weren't presenting it consistently, and that's why I'm such a huge advocate for programs like Zero, because that's the only way to get that information on a consistent daily basis is actually seeing it and hearing it through that platform. But on the flip side, sometimes the field can notice buyer hesitation before it shows up in the analytics.
mhm.
So that's why you really can't pick sides. You got to kind of marry both data sets.
Yeah, I've also talked to some of our partners that do more customer facing feedback. They go and they get the feedback from the homeowner
Mm,
on what happened in those interactions. And I think that's also an element that we don't always necessarily grab onto, because when we think about the way that perception plays into this, everybody sees things differently. It's why eyewitness testimony is not reliable. Everybody
right.
remembers things differently. And I think too, there's an element of sometimes we got to go ask the homeowner what happened to really understand the full 360 of it, because they may have been saying something, they may have been saying one thing but feeling a different way in that interaction, and
Yeah.
that could provide data too.
Yeah. And what they say to the sales rep, in the moment while they're in their home could be completely different from what they say to someone over the phone collecting that feedback because they feel
Mhm,
more safe because someone's not physically in their home.
mhm.
They're not giving direct feedback about, that person to that person. There's a third party involved. So, yeah, that's a
Mhm.
valuable tool as well. Absolutely.
So when we're trying to get feedback from our reps, like I think that in some scenarios you can have people who sort of really dominate that conversation. I mean, you were talking about like kind of the squeaky wheels in sales meetings. Yeah, I worked with a bunch of different sales coaches, and they're like, yeah, there's always somebody who's like real loud. There's always
Yeah.
somebody who's got a big opinion. But the team is larger than that. There may be newer reps. There may just be reps who are a little bit quieter in those scenarios. You also may have reps who are struggling and don't necessarily want to speak up because they don't want to call attention to their own struggles or their own issues. So, what in your experience can managers do during debrief sessions, weekly sales meetings, one on one conversations to help those maybe quieter or underperforming reps feel safe when they're sharing mistakes or ideas that they have for improvement?
It's a wonderful question. I think it's super important, but really that type of culture is nurtured from day one. Any leader that runs a sales meeting like a drill session where they berate or belittle or talk down to their team will never ever get the best results from their team. And you hear horror stories about that way too frequently in our industry. You have to always, in every meeting and every interaction, treat feedback as building blocks for improvement. And
Mm,
it should always be given to that person through compassion, right? It's not, hey, you made a mistake and then, layer a couple insults on top of that. It's, hey, let's take a look at, what we did on this appointment and let's figure out how we can improve it for the next one. It's all
mhm,
positive constructive feedback. But if that person fears you or if they fear that if they hate you, if they don't like being around you, they're going to have zero motivation to succeed for you. So this is really a practice and a behavior that needs to be stomped out in our industry for good. And
mhm.
I hope it's sooner rather than later.
So when we're collecting all of this feedback, I think there can sometimes be like death by data you're getting like too much information, and it can be really hard to prioritize what is a now goal to change versus what's a next goal to change. So once we've collected this feedback, whether it's through, data sources, analytics, the anecdotal feedback, how can, sales leaders look at prioritizing like small tweaks that can be made for the next week or two versus structural changes that are going to take time? Maybe they have to go find a sales trainer, maybe they have to go bring in a tech resource. Like how do you go about prioritizing those things?
Yeah, I look at feedback through two different lenses, and those are urgency and impact. And I think quick wins are about kind of removing that immediate friction from next week's appointments, right? The things that can impact right away. Things like tightening up a script or adjusting a promo or clarifying talking points in the house. Structural changes are about fixing kind of the root cause so that we're not fighting the same fire next year at this time.
Mhm.
And that can be, like you said, investing in better training or upgrading tech or, redefining the sales process. Both things matter, but I prioritize based on what will protect revenue in the short term while building stability for the long term. But I think the biggest trap that leaders fall into here is categorizing something as a structural change that needs to happen next year. I think that happens far too often when leaders don't want to make changes, whether that's because they don't know what to do, they don't know how it's going to work, they think it's going to be too expensive, whatever the reason might be, but they end up just kicking the can down the road instead of making that impact decision right now that could really benefit everyone on the team. And if you know there is a change that can be made that would have a major impact on the company, then you have to act and you have to get it done right away. We don't want to, treat our companies like the Titanic and have it take forever to make a life-changing or a
Mhm.
life-saving change. But you really got to act now so we can improve the company faster and see those
Mhm.
results sooner.
Yeah, I think about that ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Was it last year? Maybe the year before? Like if your organization takes that long to turn around that you get stuck, like you may
Mhm.
have some other issues that you're going to need to deal with because it shows that you really can't make change. You're not nimble enough to do that.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've seen this as often as I have, but like the bigger the organization, the
Mhm.
harder it is to make change.
Mhm.
And sadly, a lot of those bigger organizations are the ones that need to pivot faster. And because they don't, they end up suffering greatly because it just takes so long to get every location on the same page or get training done at every location. So
Mhm.
I think being not being afraid of change and understanding like, hey, we need to do this and we do need to do it fast
Mhm.
is an underrated asset that people need to do more often.
So I think sales leaders can often get kind of mired in some muck when they are trying to put together coaching plans. We've come off busy season. There's a lot of data to sift through. The leaders trying to get all of that done. They are trying to also deal with reps who may potentially be a little burnt out and who also might be a little bit worried about money going into a slower season. You've got folks who they make all of their money during a certain part of the year and it's got to last them. So how can sales leaders turn feedback into coaching plans that like really support reps and don't overwhelm them after coming off of this busy season and heading into slower times?
This really starts with making the amount of feedback manageable. And
Mm,
I have to, fully admit that I was very guilty of this during my younger years as a trainer. I would go on a ride along with a rep, and that performance would be so poor that I would give the feedback in a polite way, but I'd give so much feedback because, in my opinion, there were so many things that needed to be changed, but I did it all at once.
mm,
And I realized that, that was defeating for the person on the other side because they felt like, oh my God, I'm not doing anything right, which is true. But I didn't want to I shouldn't have delivered the message that way. Right.
mhm,
And so I really had to learn how to deliver feedback in manageable chunks and make it easy to digest for that person, one or two sections at a time.
mhm,
Give that person, a week or a few days to work on those certain items, then circle back, see how much they improved. And then if it's acceptable, then move on to the next topic and do the same thing again next week for the next improvement. But if you've got a lot to work on, trying to ask someone to work on all of it at once, I've learned from personal experience, probably not the best idea.
Yeah, taking it in bite-sized chunks is going to make it a lot easier to get what you're looking for out of that person, because they can practice and they can get something under their belt before they move on to the next skill. So as you're trying to implement these changes, you're trying to implement these coaching plans, are there any ways, or maybe dashboards or templates that you recommend for tracking rep suggestions and tracking these changes that sales leaders need to make in their organization? Like maybe any tech tools that you recommend folks using? I know you mentioned Zero. I feel like that's probably the no-brainer here to implement if you're trying to track some of these changes within the organization.
To me, that's really the only tech tool that I use for this specific function.
Mm-hmm.
Like when it comes to, really getting a clear picture of what needs to change and what needs to improve, this Zero is going to give me the most honest feedback, because it's, direct transcripts and recordings of real life interactions with homeowners. And I can see for myself, if I have 10 leads that day, I can go on and look at all 10 results, and I can see exactly where my reps performed well and then where they struggled. And from a sales perspective, that's completely invaluable data, and it's the most effective data I've ever had when it comes to being a sales trainer. But to me, there's nothing better than being able to go in and look at, in a 2-hour period, I can essentially complete 10 to 15 ride-alongs just by looking at data from any rep at any time. So to me, I always recommend that. That's the best tool for that purpose.
They're good friends of ours, so we like to recommend them too. Before we wrap up, TJ, I wanted to ask you one final question. So if our listeners did one thing, just one thing, if there's one small thing they could do tomorrow to capture better feedback from the end of this season, what would you suggest they do?
When it comes to sales, I think it all comes down to actionable data in the home. And whether that's, you or a sales manager going on ride-alongs with your team, seeing the sales process take place in the home, seeing how a customer reacts to those people, or using a tool like Zero to do that on a large scale, fast paced, right? Whichever method you want to use, you have to get that data, because sales reps are always going to say, hey, I'm doing everything perfectly, they just didn't want to buy. And we all know that's just not the case, right? So, this gives you a chance to really determine what verbiage is working and, what's the best way to do certain practices in the home. But whether it's either in person or virtually with a tool like Zero, I think ride-alongs are going to be the best tool to get actionable data.
Fantastic. Well, TJ, it has been so great to have you on. Thank you for coming on to the podcast. We've had you on a webinar, but this is the first time you've been here. It was a delight to chat with you.
Yeah, same to you. Thank you so much for having me, and I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Thanks for tuning into the Ingaged podcast. If today's episode sparked an idea for your sales team, head over to engaged.io to learn how we can help you create, share, and measure your way to success. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time.